simultaneously. This side pulled out by the force of the moon, this side pushed out by centrifugal force as we whirl through space.
The tides have been instrumental in allowing life to flourish on our planet. And this is never more true than in a unique habitat ruled entirely by the ebb and flow of salt water and fresh.
Estuaries are a place of transition, where the physical, biological and chemical properties of the marine world are transformed into the world of the freshwater and vice versa, creating a habitat that's found nowhere else on Earth. Estuaries are unique but fragile environments. They're amazingly productive and they support vast amounts of life, from tiny microscopic shrimp to large numbers of wading birds. But estuaries are also important for fish, and not just those species of fish that are specific to the estuary, but large numbers of our marine species that depend on estuaries as a vital link in their life cycle, using them as nursery areas for the juveniles. Estuaries are fed by nutrients coming down rivers and in from the sea. But what do we mean when we talk about nutrients? And where does all this edible, digestible stuff come from? If you've ever spent any time on the West Coast, you'll probably have noticed two things. One, the water is extremely cold. And two, that the plants seem to love it here. And you might wonder, well, why do the plants grow so thick here? Why do we get these big forests of kelp here and not on the East Coast where it's warmer and you'd expect them to grow? The answer, of course, is that the water is saturated with nutrients. So what I'm driving the boat through right now, it's essentially a rather chilly stew of plant food. The reason that the water here is so full of nutrients is actually the same reason that it's so cold. You see, here on the West Coast, the prevailing winds are southeasterly. And that means that they actually blow so hard they push the surface water away from the coast. That water has to be replaced. And what it's replaced by is water from down in the dark depths, where there are millennia's worth of decaying organisms. So basically, it's like water coming straight from a compost heap. It's dark, it's cold, and it's nutrient-rich. Rich enough, in fact, to allow a few species to flourish in huge numbers. 50% of all life on Earth is found in the oceans. And that's just the life that we know about, because the oceans are still largely unexplored. But what we do know is that the South African shoreline has some of the most varied and abundant life in the world. We owe that incredible richness and diversity to our two great currents, which have created not one, but two dramatically different marine worlds in one relatively small country. To the west, the cold Benguela creeps sluggishly north along the barren Namaqualand shore, bringing with it the icy waters of the South Atlantic. To the east, the picture changes dramatically. This is a coast fed by the warm Agulhas current, squeezed between Africa and Madagascar and funneling warm water down from the tropics. And the results are spectacular. A dazzling kaleidoscope of colors reveals that this is a kinder ocean than in the west. Back on the west coast, I'm about to explore a living symbol of its abundance, a golden underwater forest of kelp. Just as forests on land offer food and shelter to woodland or rainforest birds and animals, so kelp provides a habitat for dozens of marine species. Perhaps more importantly, its strong but flexible stalks and leaves act as a buffer against the pounding waves, diffusing the sea's destructive energy and allowing more delicate species to thrive inside its protective barrier. It's one thing to look at a map and see a blue arrow going up the west coast showing the Benguela Current and a red arrow coming down the east coast showing the Agulhas Current. But it's another thing altogether, experiencing it underwater for yourself.
The nutrient soup off the west coast is a blessing, but every so often it can also be malevolent.
The Benguela Current is a very productive marine ecosystem. Coastal upwelling brings massive amounts of nutrients into the water. Combined with sunlight, the microalgae found in the water can sometimes multiply on a grand scale, depleting the water of oxygen and depriving other marine creatures that depend on the vital gas, in a phenomenon we refer to as a red tide, the result of which we see here today.
Starved of oxygen, marine species are in effect suffocated in their watery home. Fish have nowhere to go, but for species with legs, there is one desperate option left: walking up onto the beach, in a phenomenon known as a walkout. And this one at Elands Bay on the west coast was enormous. Entire populations of lobster driven into the eager beaks of seagulls by the deadly tide. At this walkout, police and army were on hand to prevent a health disaster from unfolding, but they also acted as conservationists.
So these good folks here from the Department of Fisheries are doing the best that they can, trying to save as many of these poor rock lobster as possible, moving them further down the coast to where the red tide is less severe and where they stand a better chance of survival. It's really quite tragic.
On the third day of this walkout, 2,000 kilograms of lobster were rescued and put into holding tanks at Elands Bay. More than half were mature, which meant that the relatively slow growth cycle of these populations won't be too badly interrupted.
Of course, the sad reality is that as much as they're trying to save as many of these lobster, not all of them are going to make it. For example, the shy shark, it's still breathing at the moment, but it's not going to survive. So, again, it's very tragic.
Red tides are a natural phenomenon, but the carnage they bring can still appear shocking to us.
Well, you guys still have a long way to go to get to this. And thanks to today's operation, they might well stand a chance. So, into the crate they go.
We rarely see the ocean culling her own on so grand a scale. Still, one wonders whether human intervention in a natural phenomenon such as this is an entirely bad thing.
I feel it's a real person.
And it's nutritious and delicious.
It's good. I really like it.
This celebrates being South African. We love our beer, we love our food, we love our music.
For knowing who you are going, you must know where you come from.
I'm excited to be part of this year.
For all your travel trends, catch us every Sunday, 12 midday on Channel 404.
A very good morning to you, and thank you so much indeed for choosing Morning Live.
But I want to know the basic thing.
Griselda Lewis, SABC News, in Parktown, Johannesburg.
Zimbabwe.
Mzwadeli Bridge, SABC News, Luanda, Angola.
Let's take a look at your market indicators.
Thanks for staying with Morning Live. Let's bring you your sports news.
Let's take a look at your satellite image.
Set the agenda for the day with Morning Live.
32 nations, 44 matches live on SABC1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia. Our country has one of the most diverse populations in the world. For centuries, it's been a meeting place for people of different cultures and languages, all of which have contributed to a fascinating variety today. But we have a far more ancient human story preserved in the DNA of some South Africans. To find out more, I've come to see Himla Sudjal at Pinnacle Point near Mossel Bay. It's an appropriate place because caves at Pinnacle Point contain archaeological deposits from people who lived here more than 160,000 years ago.
What do the genetics tell us?
Genetic data, when you explore it in all living people today, shows quite convincingly that the modern gene pool originated in Africa. Where in Africa? Well, Southern Africa is a good candidate because people indigenous to this area, like the San and the Khoi, harbor the oldest genetic signatures found in humans today. And isn't it wonderful that right here on our doorstep are the answers to this very epic question of where did we originate?
What does the genetic evidence tell us about Africa?
If we imagine a tree, on a tree we have many, many leaves, and there's some leaves that are placed on peripheral branches and other leaves that are placed on much deeper branches. By deeper, I mean closer to the trunk. Okay. People of African origin are placed on the deeper branches of the tree.
Closer to the trunk.
Those branches closer to the trunk. And as you go out of Africa, one of the branches from Africa gives way to a branching fork in the tree that we see part of which represented in Europe, part of it represented in Asia, and within the Asian branch, we have sub-branches into the Americas. So in actual fact, the movement of humans can also be explained by this tree, where the thinning out of the tree represents that subset of humans who left Africa, probably in the vicinity of between 200 and 2,000 individuals, who eventually gave rise to the gene pool we see outside of Africa.
We have modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, emerging around 200,000 years ago. And then there's a population crash at 70,000, moving out into the rest of the world. It's not surprising that we're all so similar, genetically speaking. We're a very young species.
You know, we normally joke that if you take any two people's DNA and you mix it together, there's about 99.9% similarity. In the same breath, if you take a human's DNA and a worm's DNA, 66% of it would be the same. And we can get even better. You can take a human's DNA and mix it with a daffodil, a plant, and 33% would be the same. So does it make us 1/3 daffodil and 2/3 worm?
How do you see it sort of panning out in the end?
Well, I mean, it brings us back to this kind of exotic place. You know, we can sit on this rock and you can just imagine 150,000 years, people moving, walking around these other rocks, feeding off the ocean, shellfish, bringing it to the inside, occupying the shelters in terms of the caves we see around us.
Sitting here.
Sitting on this very rock. I mean, it is possible that somebody who has contributed to a genetic lineage to a living person today sat on this very rock.
Listening to Himmler, the waves, feeling the roughness of the rock, it's almost possible to feel a sense of intimacy with the families who lived here so long ago. It's an intimacy that comes from a story inside us, from our genes. But what of their lives? These present a bigger challenge, but it's a challenge that archaeologists are working on, and we know more each year. We have a better idea of hunter-gatherer life in more recent times.
Hunter-gatherer society varies tremendously around the world. But in a general model, it's women who do most of the gathering, and they, of course, provide most of the food. Men do the hunting, but it's not every animal that's killed that is hunted. If one kills an eland, for example, that's hunting. If you kill a tortoise, that's not regarded as hunting. Hunting is obviously of tremendous symbolic significance. Most hunter-gatherers are mobile, and they move around their territories according to the availability of resources. At times, they might disperse into small family groups. At other times, they might come together in bigger groups, where they'll renew old friendships, establish new friendships, and get married. And in this way, they can draw on these kinds of alliances in times of trouble. Clearly, the hunter-gatherers, the San or Bushman hunter-gatherers that appear in the earliest historical records of the Cape were descended in some way from later Stone Age hunter-gatherers in South Africa.
The later Stone Age is a period that begins around 25,000 years ago. It was a time of incredible climatic variation. People had to cope with extreme cold around 18,000 years ago, and then 6,000 years ago, temperatures were some 2 degrees higher than they are today. People abandoned the hot, dry interior and made for better conditions nearer the coast.
Now there is a lesson for us as we face global warming. From about 3,000 years ago, we see people becoming more sedentary. Hunter-gatherers are making wider use of the resources in their territories, and the territories are becoming smaller. In some cases, we see that the territories are becoming more strictly guarded. Access to resources has been restricted to in-groups. Out-groups are being excluded. And then, 2,000 years ago, pottery, sheep, and cattle get added to the mix. But the great challenge for archaeology still in South Africa is to find out how exactly these elements get added to the mix.
When European traders stopped at the Cape in the 16 and 1700s, they encountered Khoi herders who lived in large communities and kept sizable herds of cattle and flocks of sheep. As archaeologists, we want to know when and how that way of life developed. The answer isn't simple. Some archaeologists argue that hunter-gatherers in the far northern parts of southern Africa acquired sheep from herders, and that the practice of casual sheep keeping then diffused southwards to reach the southern Cape 2,000 years ago.
Then around 1,000 years ago, or perhaps within the last 1,000 years, Khoi-speaking herders arrived, and together with the hunters with sheep, they created the herding culture that the Dutch recorded when they first arrived. Another scenario is more heavily based on linguistic evidence, and this suggests that Khoi-speaking herders, perhaps from East Africa, arrived in the northern reaches of southern Africa, and they spread south into the western half of southern Africa through a sieve of hunter-gatherers, mixing with them culturally, linguistically, marrying with them, so that in South Africa, herders and hunters are genetically and physically indistinguishable. This linguistic scenario also allows for the possibility that the historically recorded Khoi herding practices could have developed in the last 1,000 years or so.
In particular, herders perhaps adopted ideas about cattle from the Iron Age farmers. Cattle were central to their farmers because they got married and established families by exchanging cattle for wives. To learn more about their way of life, I want to take you to the premier Iron Age site in southern Africa, Great Zimbabwe.
This is Great Zimbabwe. It's a special place. It was built between 1300 and 1450, when it was capital of the largest, most powerful kingdom that ever existed in southern Africa. Around 18,000 people lived here, with the king and his retinue on the hilltop above and commoners on the level ground at the base of the hill. The kingdom extended from beyond the Botswana border in the west to the Mozambican border in the east, an area roughly the size of France. And its trade connections reached across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, India, and China. Zimbabwe was a Shona kingdom. Its people were descended from some of the original Iron Age pioneers of southern Africa. To put them in some kind of context, we need to go back in time about 3,000 years to West Africa.
Back then, farmers in the Cameroon-Nigeria region began to spread out into East and Southern Africa in what eventually became one of the most remarkable expansions by people of a single language family anywhere in the world. By the end of it, Bantu languages dominated sub-Saharan Africa. These are languages we're familiar with. Zulu, Sotho, Tsonga, Shona, and Swahili all belong to the Bantu language family.
This is as good as it gets for an archaeologist in southern Africa. It's goosebump stuff. I mean, look at this walling. Such precision stonework. Not a drop of cement. They've built a wall that's 11 meters high. They say there are 900,000 stone blocks in this outer wall. I mean, look at the thickness of this wall. It's unbelievable. It's such a privilege to be here.
To see the king up there in his hilltop palace was no small thing.
I'm climbing the ancient pathway to the palace, and its narrowness here provokes an extraordinary sense of anticipation. One can imagine that 600 years ago, people coming to see the king, it might have inspired a sense of awe.
What an extraordinary place. It's quite magical.
Through the palace where the king lived, along with a few wives, his ritual sister, and some guards. You can get a great view of the town from up here and get some sense of what it might have looked like 600 or 700 years ago. Along with the walls, you need to imagine thousands of houses densely packed so that their roofs touched one another. And then in the territory around the capital, people living in ordinary homesteads, farming and producing the food that supported the capital. Farming, of course, is the reason why people expanded out of West Africa in the first place. People were looking for new lands, new pastures, new sources of iron ore. They were cultivating crops like sorghum and the millets, and kept cattle, sheep and goats, as well as chickens and dogs. They were also metallurgists and extracted iron and copper from ore to make tools and jewelry. Later they worked gold, tin, bronze and brass. But iron was always the most important, mainly for hoes for agriculture. And for this reason, archaeologists tend to use the shorthand term, the Iron Age, to refer to this period.
Iron Age farmers first reached South Africa about 1,700 years ago and settled throughout the bushveld regions in the northern and eastern parts of the country, where they found good soils, sweetveldt grazing, and wood for fuel. Later, about 700 years ago, some farmers moved on to the grasslands of the highveld, but always they were restricted to areas where good summer rains fell because of their crops. So settlement expanded and contracted according to changes in climate.
Underneath all this magnificence, all this grandeur, beyond the town, farmers lived in simple homesteads, working their fields, minding their cattle, producing food, and generally ensuring that the cycle of life continued. In the end, it was the homestead that survived the rise and fall of kingdoms like Zimbabwe, the rise and fall of chiefdoms, climatic disasters. It lasted for some 2,000 years before colonization turned it into a pale ghost of itself. The homestead was really quite a remarkable institution, and it provided the heartbeat of Iron Age life.
This is a journey around our coast. What is our coast? Legally, it's the part that lies south of two lines on a map. But borders are entirely abstract creations. Animals and plants ignore them. The climate is the same on either side of them. South Africa's borders seem relatively logical, following